Does it sometimes feel like your house turns into a tug of war with your kids pulling one way and you pulling the other, and there's no way to meet in the middle? Like the more you talk, the less they listen? Well, there is a way to move your kids from resistance to cooperation. Hi, I am Marcia Amaro, and I have a passion for helping parents build the toolbox of communication skills that will help them create positive environments in their family where everybody can truly thrive, and that includes kids, parents, and everybody else in the home. And today we're going to talk about what it is that causes that resistance sometimes and how we can move our kids from resistance to cooperation in 3 very simple steps. But before we do, I want to start by illustrating all of this with a story. A while back, I had a student called Sam, and Sam was absolutely brilliant. He was straight A's from kindergarten through 6th grade, model student, never gave anybody any issues at school or at home. Then all of a sudden, in 7th grade, everything changed. In what seemed to be an overnight shift, Sam went from straight A student to C's, D's, and F's, and to being a really big behavior problem both at home and at school. When I sat down to talk to Sam, he seemed angry and frustrated, and he was very shut down. He had this attitude, everything crossed, arms, legs, everything crossed. Like, I'm not letting my guard down and you're not getting in. And once I got him to talk, it turns out that he was, in fact, angry and upset. Because see, here's what happened. When his parents and teachers realized that he had all this potential, that he could get all straight A's, that he didn't even have to try too hard to get good grades, they started pushing him to become a doctor. His parents were adamant that he was going to be a doctor one day. But guess what? Sam didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a video game designer. So one day he realized, being the smart kid that he was, well, if straight A's and good behavior are what is making everybody push me to be a doctor, I'll stop the good grades and the good behavior. And I'll start acting in a way that is okay for a video game designer. So what happened with Sam is what happens with a lot of our kids. They need 2 really big things. And when they don't get these 2 things, that's when they start shifting and moving into resistance. And those 2 things are acceptance and power. And when I explain them, they might seem a little bit contradictory, but stick with me and they will make sense. Everybody, kids of all ages and even adults, we need to feel accepted. We struggle to learn who we are and to become comfortable with ourselves. But part of that is knowing that the people around us accept us, understand us, and see us for who we are. And part of that is knowing that the important people around them are open to really listening to what they have to say. So when a kid starts to communicate certain key things are important to them, they need to feel that the adults around them are fully, truly listening with what I call curious listening. And we will talk more about that in a future video. But you need to give space for the kids to tell you what they need to tell you without harsh reactions, without judgment in your face, and without sarcasm in your voice. And that's the first thing they need, acceptance. The second thing they need is to feel a certain sense of power, right? By that, I don't mean that you're going to be hands-off, give them full control, let them do whatever they want. That is never a good thing. We know this. But how do you give them a sense of power and control? Well, by giving them choices, by allowing them to make decisions at certain moments in their lives and letting them face the consequences. Those 2 things combined are what will help us raise adults that are fully self-reliant and resilient, that can make decisions and stand by them, face the consequences, but bounce back when those consequences aren't the best. So going back to the 3 steps that we can start implementing to help us move our kids from resistance to cooperation, I first need to remind you of a previous video in which I talked about not expecting things you haven't clearly communicated. And that's where we're going to start. When you set expectations with your kids, the first thing is it needs to be a dialogue. It cannot be just a directive. Now, when you say, For this example, let's say do the dishes, do the dishes, do the dishes, do the dishes, and you repeat it constantly, that is going to be the expectation they have. That when you need them to do the dishes, you're going to tell them. So instead, change it to, I expect that you will do the dishes every day after you get things dirty. Right? That is a lot better than just repeating yourself over and over and over and the nagging instinct, right? But it's still a directive, it's still a mandate, it's still telling them what to do. So to move it one step further so you can go from resistance to cooperation, if that's where you're having the resistance, try this. Turn it into a dialogue. Look for a moment in which everything is calm, it's not the heat of the moment, you haven't been nagging them about it, everybody's calm, everybody's happy. Sit down and have a conversation with them and start with something like, do you understand why it is important for me that you do the dishes? Give them time and space to talk to you about it and really listen and try not to react. They might say, no, I have no clue. It's just dishes. And that's fine. But then it's your turn to try and make them feel what you feel. So you could say something like, there's a lot of things that need to be done in the house. And very often I feel like all the burden falls on my shoulder. And how do you think that makes me feel when that happens? Give them a minute to try and empathize with you. If they don't say anything, or even if they say something that doesn't match, say, well, I would love for you to understand that when that happens, I feel overloaded, overwhelmed, and frustrated, and that's when I get angry and grumpy and naggy. So can you see why it might be important for me to get as much help as I can, even in the little things like doing the dishes? Once that is established, then you can go into the clear expectation, right? So I expect you to please do the dishes every time you get something dirty, wash it. Simple. And then ask them, do you think you can do that? And listen to what they have to say, right? You're not going to let them get away with saying no. But you might ask them, okay, if you can't do it right away, when can I expect you to do them? How can we work it out so that I feel the help and everything is better and I don't have to nag you all the time? And be a little flexible if you can. If you can't, then tell them, no, I need you to do it this time, right? After the expectation has been clearly set, have them repeat back to you what you just talked about, what you expected. So you ask them, okay, so what did we agree? What is the expectation? The expectation is that I will clean everything that I get dirty as soon as I'm done with it. Great, awesome. And that is the first step, is actually making sure that there's a two-sided communication in these expectations and that they really understood what you told them and what you discussed, right? What the expectation is. The second step is make sure that in the process of clarifying expectations, you set clear consequences for the moment when it isn't done. And trust me, there will be moments when it isn't done, right? But if you're anything like me, if you're in the heat of the moment and you see that they didn't do the dishes one more time even after we talked about it, you explode and you go into this far end of the spectrum of consequences, right? So they didn't do the dishes and you want to take their phone away for a week, or they didn't make their bed and you want to ground them for a month. And that is, of course, I'm going to extremes here and I'm exaggerating, but we do tend to go overboard with the consequences because we have not established boundaries for ourselves and for them in terms of those consequences, right? So as part of this whole conversation of this is the expectation, this is why, did you understand it, repeat it back to me, the last question in that conversation should be, and what do you think the consequences should be if you choose not to do the dishes, right? Now notice the wording here. What do you think the consequences should be if you choose not to do the dishes? It's their choice. You're giving them that power. You're giving them that option. But they need to match and understand and start making the connection between their choices and the consequences that they have to face. So tell them, okay, this is what's going to happen. There will be consequences if you make this choice. and listen to them. Oftentimes kids will be harsher than we are in establishing what the consequences need to be. But you have to be the one who's ultimately comfortable with that consequence. So listen to their suggestions. If they say, okay, if I don't do the dishes, you can take my phone for a week. You know that's too harsh and it doesn't really fit the crime, so to speak. The consequence doesn't fit the crime. So take them down a little bit. Say, okay, that's interesting, and I'm glad you realize that the phone is a privilege that can be taken away. But let's think about this. It's just not doing the dishes. So how about if when you don't do your dishes, then you're responsible for doing everybody's dishes that night after dinner, and that's your consequence. Or something along those lines. Talk about it, think about it. Come to the conversation with some consequences in mind that you think might fit the expectation that you have, and make them ask suggestions, but only after you have asked them for their input. And then make sure they repeat it back. Okay, so what is going to be the consequence if you don't do the dishes? And maybe even talk about different levels, right? Like the first time, it's a warning. So the first time I'm going to remind you what our agreement was, and I'm going to ask you to do it. The second time, then it's this consequence. And I know we're not going to get to a third time. Something along those lines, but make sure that you have their feedback and that there's a conversation ahead of time, because that will prevent you from going off the deep end when you're angry about them not doing what they were supposed to do. And that is also going to make it so that they know what they're getting themselves into if they choose not to do what you talked about, right? And that leads me to the third thing, which is whenever possible, be flexible and give them choices. I said whenever possible, right? There are moments in which you have to do this, that's it. But there are moments in which, let's face it, we are just too set in our own ways, and we don't give room for them to decide what their ways are. And sometimes we have to give them a little space, right? So for example, your cleaning day might be Saturday, and you might want them to clean their room on Saturday, but they might be off Saturday and Sunday and even Friday afternoon. So give them 2, maximum 3 choices and tell them, look, I'm going to clean the house tomorrow. Do you want to clean it now or tomorrow when I clean the house? Or do you want to clean it today when I'm cleaning the house, or tomorrow, Sunday? And give them that choice, but make sure they agree that they're going to do it. Make sure they repeat back to you what they're going to do, and make sure that they follow through. Does that make sense? So again, to start moving your kids from resistance to cooperation, make sure that setting expectations is a two-way conversation in which they express understanding and agreement. Second, make sure that you establish the consequences for not following through as part of that expectation setting conversation. And finally, make sure that you're giving them the opportunity to choose, to feel like they have some control over their lives, and to face the potential consequences of making the wrong choice. I hope you found value in the information I presented to you today. If you did, please share this video with anybody you know that might benefit from it. And also, go over to my YouTube channel, subscribe, and make sure that you leave a comment below, letting me know what parts of this make sense to you, resonated with you, what parts you might still struggle with, and any other questions that you might have, any topics that you might want me to address in future videos. I would love to hear from you. So again, please leave a comment below, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much. See you in the next one.
Artlist.io